She always believed that her marriage to Frank was built on unwavering love and trust. But after his death, Linda discovers a secret buried in his past. A confession recorded on an old tape that unveils a love lost in the chaos of war. A promise made to someone named Mai that he never fulfilled. Before we dive into the story, let me know where you're tuning in from today. And if you enjoy this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more. Linda walked through the corridor of her home, feeling the familiar ache in her chest that often followed her these days. It had been only 3 months since Frank's passing. He had grown older in a quiet, unassuming way, never complaining about his aches and pains until it was too late. The memory of his last moments in the hospital clung to Linda's thoughts. The beeping machines, the starchy white sheets, Frank's tired eyes looking at her with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. She had expected sadness in the aftermath, but not the lingering sense of incomplete business. There had always been a certain reticence to Frank's stories about his past. He was, at times, an open book about his life in the States, how he loved old westerns, classic rock, or the evenings out with friends, but whenever the subject of his time in Vietnam came up, he deflected with jokes or changed the topic. In nearly 40 years of marriage, Linda had learned to respect that boundary, figuring it was the trauma of war. Now, with him gone, she felt an uneasy pull to understand what had weighed on him for so long. The day she found the tape recorder, she had set aside hours to organize a musty storage unit Frank had rented. The place was stacked with unmarked cardboard boxes, battered suitcases, and random furniture draped in dust covers. She felt both exasperation and curiosity. Exasperation at the sheer volume of objects she had to deal with, curiosity about the secrets they might hold. Carefully, she opened a weathered trunk. Inside, she discovered a collection of old photographs, medals from Frank's service, some neatly folded uniforms. Her throat tightened at the sight of the medals. She felt pride and sorrow swirl together, recalling that in life, Frank had never bragged about his commendations. He had told her once that the medals did little to erase the painful memories. She continued rummaging, pulling out trinkets and papers. One box contained a bundle of postcards from decades ago, the edges yellowed with age. Another box, tucked underneath, held the reel-to-reel tape recorder and a handful of labeled tapes. The words scrawled on the cardboard cover were faded, nearly impossible to decipher. She lifted the recorder, coughed at the cloud of dust it unleashed, and then gently placed it on a makeshift table. The presence of a tape recorder among Frank's relics piqued her interest. Frank had never mentioned recording anything. What might be on those spools of tape? She flipped through the tapes, not recognizing any labeling except for random dates. 1968, 1969, 1970. They coincided with Frank's time in Vietnam. Linda felt a little jolt of anticipation. Perhaps these were field recordings of something official, or maybe just random audio diaries Frank had made. She plugged in the old device using an extension cord. Miraculously, it still fit into the battered socket near the overhead bulb. Her heart beat faster as she threaded the tape. She pressed play. A hiss of static emerged. She leaned closer, straining to hear, adjusting the volume knob until faint words crackled through. At first, she couldn't make out the language. The voice was Frank's, recognizable even in the scratchy recording, but the words he spoke were in Vietnamese. Linda blinked in surprise. She had known Frank picked up some Vietnamese phrases during the war, but he rarely used them around her. She listened carefully. Frank spoke haltingly, but with an obvious attempt at proper pronunciation. She caught a repeated name, Mai. Then the phrase, "I will come back for you," repeated again. His tone was gentle, almost pleading, tinged with a sadness she'd never heard in him before. Linda's skin prickled. She stopped the tape, rewound, listened again. The name Mai, the promise to return. Frank's voice speaking with a tenderness that unsettled her. She might have dismissed it as a fragment of a conversation he recorded out of context, but it felt more personal, more intimate. Frank's voice trembled in moments, as though he had laid his soul bare on these tapes. Unable to tear herself away, Linda listened to the entire reel. She heard confessions of love, of heartbreak, of a vow never fulfilled. Her throat constricted, and tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. This was no ordinary war log. This was Frank's hidden lament for someone named Mai. She felt disoriented, as if the stable ground beneath her shifted. Frank had loved her. Linda was sure of that. Their life together wasn't perfect, but it was built on shared trust and companionship. They had raised 2 children, endured financial ups and downs, celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. Never had she suspected that Frank carried the memory of another woman so intensely. The fact that he had recorded himself speaking to Mai, presumably after the war, suggested that he had never truly let her go. That evening, Linda took the reel-to-reel home, anxious to see if the other tapes contained more. She didn't want to dwell on jealousy, but she felt a pang of betrayal. Why had Frank never told her? She wasn't naive. She knew that soldiers in Vietnam sometimes formed relationships, that war and loneliness could forge intense bonds. But to keep it secret all these years, to keep tapes in a storage unit, why? Could he not trust her? Or was the burden too painful? Unable to sleep, Linda set up the recorder in the living room. The old machine whirred softly, reminding her of a museum artifact. She put in a second tape, dated 1969. The hiss started, and once again Frank's voice emerged, speaking in halting Vietnamese. Occasionally he switched to English. Linda heard him mention Saigon, mention waiting. She recognized sadness in his tone. Then, fragments of another phrase, my love, and I'm sorry. The tape ended abruptly, leaving Linda's heart heavy with unanswered questions. She rummaged through the storage boxes again, determined to see if there were letters or journals that might clarify. Eventually, near the bottom of a box filled with old postcards, she found them. A stack of letters addressed to Mai in Saigon. The letters were never sent. No postage stamps, no official mailing addresses beyond a few cryptic lines. Linda's hand shook as she read the first lines. They were dated around the same time as the tapes. The content was heartbreaking. Frank professing love, regret at leaving, a promise to return for her. She read line after line of longing. A repeated phrase jumped out at her. I will bring you to America no matter what. Linda swallowed, feeling a pang of sympathy for the younger Frank, a soldier torn by war and love. Yet she also felt the sting of discovering that her husband had withheld this part of his life. She remembered times when Frank seemed distant, particularly on anniversaries that coincided with the war. Could he have been thinking of Mai? The next day, Linda tried to focus on normalcy. She went shopping, responded to condolences from friends, attempted to pick up the threads of daily life. But her mind continually circled back to the letters and tapes. In quiet moments, she pictured Frank in his 20s, uniform dusty from the Saigon heat, forging a bond with a local woman amid the chaos. She attempted to quell the jealousy creeping in, reminding herself that this was before she met him. But still, a bitterness mingled with sorrow. She realized she needed closure, needed to understand who Mai was, what she had meant to Frank, and what had torn them apart. Her daughter, Samantha, noticed Linda's pensive mood. Over tea in Linda's living room, Samantha asked how the storage cleanup was going, if Linda had found anything interesting. Linda hesitated, uncertain whether to share this revelation about Frank's past. Finally, she disclosed the basics: that Frank apparently loved a Vietnamese woman named Mai, that he recorded tapes in Vietnamese. Samantha's eyes widened. She, too, had known how guarded Frank was about the war. Do you think it was something official? She asked, voice hushed. Maybe a covert mission? He always said that time was complicated. Linda shook her head, explaining the depth of emotion she heard on the tapes. This wasn't official. It was personal. Samantha looked troubled but urged Linda to find answers if she needed them for peace of mind. Linda felt a flicker of gratitude for her daughter's understanding. Linda decided to request Frank's military records. She wrote to the National Archives, asking for the full details of his service. The response was slow in coming, as bureaucracy always was. In the meantime, Linda listened to all the tapes, forming a rough timeline of Frank's relationship with Mai. It appeared they met in Saigon in 1968, soon after Frank's deployment. The tapes contained references to a small coffee shop, to the sound of bombs in the distance, to stolen hours in a courtyard. Frank's voice on the tapes was raw, vulnerable. She recognized the same man she knew, but younger, fueled by longing instead of the calm acceptance he showed in later life. When the records finally arrived, Linda pored over them, scanning the official lines for references to Frank's whereabouts, his duties, any mention of local connections. The files confirmed he had been stationed in Saigon from mid-1968 to early 1970. They mentioned a few injuries, a brief hospital stay. Linda's eyes caught on a note. Reassigned to stateside duty after sustaining injury. She found no mention of Mai or any local relationships. Of course, she doubted there would be. But the details about the abrupt reassignment intrigued her. The records also showed how Frank had been under certain confidentiality constraints. Linda wondered if the military had intercepted or destroyed any letters from him to Mai. The possibility made her shiver. Had the war machinery itself forbidden his attempt to bring Mai to the U.S.? The question gnawed at her. She reached out to a couple of Frank's old war buddies she vaguely remembered from years back. One had passed away. Another had moved overseas. The few that answered her calls knew nothing about Frank's possible romance in Saigon, or at least claimed ignorance. One old friend speculated that relationships with Vietnamese civilians were frowned upon by the higher-ups, especially if they suspected infiltration or risk. Linda realized that might be the reason Frank's letters never reached Mai. The intangible nature of it all weighed on her. She felt sympathy for the young man Frank once was, blocked by red tape and politics from returning to the woman he loved. Yet Linda's curiosity was not satisfied. She could not simply accept that Frank had once loved someone named Mai and left her behind. Part of her felt a sense of moral obligation. She imagined Mai living in Vietnam, possibly married to someone else, or perhaps alone, holding on to the memory of an American soldier who vanished without explanation. For Linda's own peace, and for Mai's, she decided to go further. She would travel to Vietnam herself and see if she could locate this woman. The notion felt audacious. Linda was no seasoned traveler. She had never been outside the country except for a short trip to Canada decades ago. Yet the voice in her heart insisted that she do this. She wanted to be sure that Frank's final vow, unfulfilled, could at least be acknowledged, if not laid to rest. She approached Samantha with the idea. Her daughter frowned, concerned for Linda's emotional well-being, worried it might dredge up more pain. But Linda explained she felt a strange calling to do it, that she couldn't live with the knowledge of these tapes without attempting closure. Samantha, supportive but anxious, helped Linda arrange the flight, find a translator, and plan an itinerary. Linda's son, Thomas, was more skeptical, warning that she might open wounds or discover things that would only hurt her further. But Linda felt resolute. She told Thomas it was something she had to do, for Frank, for Mai, and for herself. The day Linda boarded the plane to Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, as it was officially renamed, she was both excited and terrified. She carried with her a suitcase of practical clothes, a small stash of the letters Frank had written to Mai, and the tapes in digital format on her phone. She had transferred them so she could reference Frank's words if needed. As the plane soared over oceans, Linda gazed at the clouds, remembering a younger Frank in uniform. She tried to imagine the smell of the city he once described: heat, spices, the metallic tang of fear in the air. She pressed her hand to the window, murmuring a promise that she would see this through. Touching down at Tan Son Nhut Airport, Linda felt the tropical warmth wash over her. The air carried a bustle of scooters, cars, the chatter of travelers. She felt disoriented, reliant on signs in English to find her way. Her translator, a polite young man named Quang, greeted her with a sign. He had been recommended by a friend of Samantha's. Quang offered a friendly smile, speaking English with care. Linda, nerves jangling, thanked him for meeting her. She told him a partial truth. She was here to research her late husband's time in Saigon, with hopes of finding an old acquaintance. Quang nodded, sympathetic. She didn't elaborate on the emotional intensity behind her quest, though maybe he sensed it. The ride into the city awed her. She saw modern skyscrapers mixed with older buildings. Everywhere, the streets were crowded with scooters, horns beeping in a chaotic symphony. Neon signs clashed with weathered colonial facades. Linda felt an odd sense of sadness, imagining how different it had been 50 years ago, during war. She checked into a modest hotel near the city center. That night, jet-lagged and restless, she lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, thinking of Frank. In her mind, she pictured him walking these same streets in another era, a soldier with fear in his heart, yet finding love in a war zone. She wondered if the city's transformation paralleled the transformation of all the silent pains he had carried. Over the next days, Linda and Kwong set about their search. They began at the local archives and libraries, though Linda knew it was a long shot. She sought records that might indicate a woman named Mai connected to an American soldier, but the war's chaos left many documents incomplete or destroyed. Kwong made phone calls, asked older staff, but found no direct leads. Linda realized she might have to rely on memory and personal stories rather than official archives. They visited neighborhoods Frank had mentioned in passing on the tapes. One old quarter near the river had been partially redeveloped, with new shops overshadowing old alleyways. Linda felt disheartened, searching for a coffee shop Frank described, only to find it replaced by a sleek bank. Yet in that same district, they encountered an older resident who perked up at the mention of Mai. She said it was a common name but recalled a Mai who once lived there. She provided an address. Linda's excitement soared. Maybe it was the same Mai. But upon arriving, she found a younger family living there. No connection to Frank's story. Another dead end. Despite the frustrations, Linda refused to give up. Each evening, she returned to her hotel, physically tired from trudging through the heat and emotionally exhausted from hopes dashed. She listened to fragments of Frank's tapes again, trying to decipher more clues. The mention of a particular street corner, a reference to a small park. Kwong studied them too, gleaning that Frank might have spent a lot of time in a certain district that had historically been known for small family-run restaurants. One day they explored that district, asking around in little markets. Most people shook their heads or offered polite shrugs. Linda's morale dipped, yet she felt the pull of Frank's words urging her on. A breakthrough occurred on the 6th day. In a quiet side street, Linda and Kwong entered a tiny shop that sold antiques and memorabilia from the war era. It was dimly lit, the shelves lined with old postcards, battered helmets, rusted Zippo lighters bearing soldier inscriptions. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with sharp eyes, listened patiently to Kwong's explanation that Linda was searching for a woman named Mai who had known an American soldier decades ago. The shopkeeper said nothing for a moment, then rummaged behind the counter and pulled out a dusty photo album. He flipped to a photograph showing a younger version of himself with a small group of Vietnamese women, possibly from the early 1970s. He pointed to one of them, an elegant figure with long black hair, smiling shyly. He said her name was Mai, and she used to frequent a certain area. Linda's heart soared. The man explained that Mai once helped him run errands, sold homemade goods, and lived in a modest house outside the city after the war ended. He hadn't seen her in years, but believed she still resided in a village about an hour away. Linda's hands trembled. It was the first real lead. She asked if the shopkeeper could recall more. He closed the album gently, describing how Mai had lost contact with a foreign man who left abruptly. Linda's eyes watered. This matched Frank's timeline. The shopkeeper wrote down directions to the village. He wished her luck, saying he believed Mai was still around if she hadn't moved. Linda thanked him profusely, resisting the urge to embrace the man. Kwong arranged for a car the next morning. They drove out of Saigon early, passing through suburbs that gradually gave way to more rural scenery. The air turned fresher, the traffic thinned. Linda stared out the window at rice paddies shimmering under the sun, workers in conical hats tending the fields. She tried to imagine how Frank had felt traveling these roads. Her pulse thudded faster as they neared the village. She felt excitement tinged with fear. What if Mai didn't want to see her? What if Mai had passed away? Or what if this was the wrong Mai entirely? Finally, they reached a modest settlement of single-story homes, fruit trees lining the dusty lanes. Kwong asked around, showing the photograph from the shopkeeper's album, which Linda had quickly snapped a picture of with her phone. A neighbor recognized the face, directing them to a small house at the village's edge. Linda's heart pounded as they approached. The house was simple, painted in peeling pastel. A courtyard held potted plants, and an older woman sat in the shade, shelling peanuts. She looked up, eyes momentarily curious at the sight of foreigners. Kwong greeted her politely, explaining that Linda was seeking a woman named Mai who once had ties to an American soldier. The older woman nodded, set aside her peanuts, and introduced herself as Mai. Linda felt tears well up, a wave of relief and trepidation colliding. Mai stood slowly, leaning on a wooden cane. She beckoned them inside with a gracious gesture. The interior was humble but warm. A table, some mismatched chairs, photographs on the walls. Linda's gaze lingered on the pictures, scanning for any sign of Frank. But the images mostly showed Mai in younger days, sometimes with other locals or by herself. As they settled, Linda felt her throat tighten, uncertain how to begin. Kwong gently explained Linda's purpose, that her late husband, Frank, had served in Vietnam, and Linda believed he had known Mai intimately. Mai listened, her weathered face revealing little at first. Then, when Kwong uttered Frank's name, something flickered in her eyes. She asked a question, voice trembling. Kwong translated. "She wants to know if you have something of Frank's." Linda opened her bag, pulling out the letters Frank had written but never sent. She held them out, feeling tears threaten. Mai took the letters, carefully unfolding the top one, scanning the words. Her eyes glistened. She placed a hand over her mouth, exhaling a shaky breath. Through Kwong, Mai explained that decades ago, she had indeed fallen in love with an American soldier named Frank. He had been kind, respectful, different from many others. They had met when he visited a friend's place near her parents' shop. Their relationship blossomed against the backdrop of war, a refuge from fear. He talked about taking her to America, promised he would come for her once the war was done. But one day he vanished, rumored to have been badly injured and shipped home. No letters arrived. She waited, believing for years that perhaps he couldn't find her address, or that letters were lost in the chaos. Eventually, she accepted he was gone. She never married. Her life carried on quietly, overshadowed by that heartbreak. Linda struggled with her emotions, hearing this confirmation. She told Kwong to convey how sorry she was that Mai had waited in vain. Mai nodded, tears trickling down her lined cheeks. She touched the letters gently, almost reverently. It was clear that the closure Linda sought was also the closure Mai had yearned for. Linda found the courage to share the tapes, digitally on her phone. She played a snippet of Frank's recorded voice speaking in Vietnamese, saying, "Mai, I will come back for you." Mai closed her eyes, trembling, as if the voice resurrected a ghost from her past. They spent hours in conversation, Linda and Mai, bridging the language barrier with Kwong's help and the universal language of sorrow and empathy. Linda learned the tiny details of how Frank made Mai laugh by mispronouncing Vietnamese words, how he once gave her a small silver bracelet. Mai disappeared into another room, returning with an old box of memorabilia, a faded photograph of her and a younger Frank, arms draped around each other. The image struck Linda like a physical blow. Frank in uniform, smiling with an openness she'd never seen in their decades together. Mai explained the heartbreak that followed. She had hoped each day for a letter or sign, but as the war ended and the city changed hands, she realized she might never see him again. Linda's chest ached. She reached out, taking Mai's hand, tears slipping down her own cheeks. Through Kwong, she expressed that Frank also mourned that lost future. He recorded tapes in which he confessed his undying love, but the military had blocked him from returning, or so Linda's research suggested. Linda apologized on Frank's behalf, for the silence, for the letters never sent. Mai nodded gently, understanding that perhaps it wasn't entirely Frank's choice. Late that afternoon, Mai prepared tea. The two women sat on the small porch, the sun slanting through the trees. Linda felt surreal. The man who connected them was gone, yet here they were, forging a bond. She realized that Frank's regret, which she had once resented, was a testament to the man's capacity for deep love. She felt no jealousy now, just a profound sense of sadness that both she and Mai had loved the same man in different lifetimes, and that he had loved them both in his own ways. Over the following days, Linda visited Mai repeatedly, learning about her life in the aftermath. Mai had faced hardships, family members lost, economic struggles under new regimes, but she persevered. She never remarried. Linda realized that Mai had saved photographs of Frank, small keepsakes that kept his memory alive. Linda offered Mai the letters, wanting her to have them at last. Mai accepted them with trembling hands, tears rolling. She said softly, through Kwang's translation, "Thank you for bringing me his words. They are all I have of him now." Linda felt a sense of purpose fulfilled. Meanwhile, Linda told Mai of her own marriage to Frank, the children they raised, the life they built. It felt strange yet comforting to share these details, as if bridging the gap in Frank's story. Mai listened intently. At times, Linda worried Mai might resent hearing how Frank went on to build a new life, but Mai seemed at peace, merely grateful to learn that Frank had not forgotten her. Indeed, Linda explained how Frank's tapes spoke of regret even in older age, how he quietly carried Mai's memory like an unhealed wound. On Linda's final day in the village, Mai brought out an old photo album Linda hadn't yet seen. There, Linda saw more pictures. Mai's younger self with local friends and occasionally, a foreign silhouette half out of frame, presumably Frank, capturing the small joys they had. Linda tried to soak in each detail, as if she were collecting pieces of Frank's lost timeline. Mai confided that she used to visit the spot where she and Frank first met, in the hope that a miracle might bring him back. Over time, she realized life's harshness, but she never cursed him. She believed he was forced to choose. As Linda prepared to leave Vietnam, she stood with Mai in that modest courtyard. They clasped hands in a gesture of mutual understanding. Linda felt tears again, but also a sense of closure forming. She spoke from her heart, that Frank never meant to abandon Mai, that war and outside forces had taken the choice away. Kwang translated, voice thick with emotion. Mai nodded, offering Linda a gentle embrace. For a moment, they simply held each other, two women tethered by a man neither of them could fully claim, yet both had loved deeply. Linda returned to Saigon, breathless from the intensity of it all. She realized that while she had come seeking answers, she had also given Mai something precious, the knowledge that Frank had, in his own way, tried to keep his promise. She felt no illusions about reversing time. The decades lost could never be reclaimed. But she also felt a measure of peace. Frank's secret no longer hung unspoken. He had, in some sense, made it back to Mai through Linda's act of delivering those unsent letters and tapes. Her flight home was a swirl of reflections. She gazed out the plane window at the expanse of sky, imagining Frank as a young soldier, torn between duty and love. She whispered a silent apology for any anger she had felt. She understood now that he had compartmentalized that chapter of his life not out of betrayal, but out of heartbreak and fear that no one could understand. Linda felt that she had done her best to honor Frank's memory by connecting with Mai. The story was not one of infidelity, but one of two loves forged in two different times of his life. A man who had once promised to return to a war-torn city, but was prevented by forces beyond his control. Landing in the U.S., Linda stepped through customs with an odd blend of exhaustion and calm. Samantha was waiting in the arrivals area, worry on her face, but also relief. She embraced Linda, asking if she found what she was looking for. Linda only answered with tears and a nod. Over the next weeks, Linda shared bits of her journey with her children, carefully explaining that Frank had once loved Mai deeply, yet had also loved Linda and built a life with her. Samantha and Thomas struggled to process it, torn between surprise and empathy. Linda assured them that Frank's love for their family wasn't diminished. Thomas asked if Linda felt betrayed. She admitted that initially she had, but meeting Mai changed her perspective. She saw how Frank had been trapped by the war's repercussions. Time passed. Linda found a renewed energy for life, something she hadn't anticipated. She took up new hobbies, volunteered, traveled to see old friends. The process of handling Frank's estate continued, but now she kept the reel-to-reel tapes carefully labeled, planning to preserve them as part of Frank's complicated legacy. She even typed out transcripts of the tapes. Where Frank spoke in Vietnamese, she used the translations Quang had provided. She wanted to ensure no detail was lost to the static of old technology. The letters she had discovered, which she had scanned, remained with Mai's originals in a safe place, symbolizing the bridging of their worlds. Months later, Linda received a small package from Vietnam. Inside was a letter from Quang, explaining that Mai had asked him to forward something. It was a black-and-white photograph of Frank and Mai together, newly reproduced from an old negative. On the back, a short note in Quang's hand read, "For Linda, so she remembers that he was once loved here, too." Linda pressed the photograph to her heart, tears filling her eyes. She framed it, placing it beside a photograph of her and Frank on their wedding day. There they were, two images of the same man, each capturing a different lifetime of love. Linda found it surprisingly comforting, as if the puzzle of Frank's heart was now complete. She wrote Mai a letter in return, with Quang's help, expressing gratitude for the photograph, for sharing her memories, for giving Linda the missing pieces of Frank's story. She described how each day she found new respect for the sacrifice and heartbreak so many endured during the war. She said that if Mai ever needed anything from her, she would do her best to help. She ended the letter with a simple sign-off, calling Mai a friend. In the quiet after that intense chapter, Linda reflected on everything. She recognized that the war had inflicted deeper wounds than she had ever realized. Frank had lived with regret and longing, hidden from Linda not because he didn't trust her, but because the pain was too deep to share. She felt no anger now, only sadness that he had to bear it alone. She wished she could have held him in those final days, telling him she understood, that she forgave him if he ever felt he needed forgiveness, that his love for Mai and his love for Linda were not contradictions, but chapters of a life shaped by circumstances beyond his control. She spent more time with her children, noticing that the tension she once carried had lifted. Samantha commented that Linda seemed lighter, as though the burden of grief was replaced by a sense of purpose. Linda confided that, in some mysterious way, meeting Mai had provided a deeper connection to Frank, even in his absence. She felt that part of her soul had joined him in that earlier time, standing beside him in Saigon, acknowledging the love he had shared. The resolution was not dramatic or triumphant. Rather, it was quiet, introspective, and healing. Linda accepted that she and Mai were both integral to Frank's story, each love existing in separate times, but each real in its own right. The heartbreak of war, the unstoppable current of years, and the quiet yearning that lingered in Frank's eyes. These were truths that Linda now held close, shaping her understanding of the man she had called husband. She discovered that acknowledging his secret past did not tarnish their marriage, but rather enriched her sense of who Frank truly was. Occasionally, Linda re-listened to the tapes, this time with calm gratitude rather than shock. She would close her eyes, letting Frank's voice wash over her, still so familiar, but layered with the gentleness he had once shown to Mai. She no longer felt threatened or jealous. Instead, she recognized the common thread that ran through all of Frank's relationships, a capacity for compassion and devotion. Linda believed that if circumstances had allowed, Frank would have brought Mai to America. Perhaps he would never have met Linda, or their children would never have been born. Life was shaped by that twist of fate, that separation enforced by politics and the chain of command. On the anniversary of Frank's death, Linda visited his grave, alone. She brought a small candle, which she lit in the late afternoon sun. She stood there, reading aloud a letter she had written to him. In it, she expressed how she had found Mai, how she understood now the sorrow he carried. She thanked him for the years they shared, for the family they built, and for the lessons she learned about love's resilience. She wept, but it was a cleansing weeping, not the anguished sobs of unresolved grief. The breeze carried away her words, and Linda felt a gentle peace settle over her. She pictured Frank smiling at Mai under a Saigon moon, and she offered a silent blessing that wherever his spirit might be, he no longer felt the weight of unfulfilled promises. In the months that followed, Linda lived more fully, forging new friendships, traveling to other places she had once only dreamed of. She remained in sporadic contact with Mai, exchanging brief letters through Kwang's translation. Each note shared small glimpses of their lives. Mai described the harvest in her village. Linda spoke of her grandchildren. It felt like a quiet testament that love and understanding could transcend continents, bridging two women who might otherwise have been rivals in another story, but had chosen compassion instead. The day Linda decided to reorganize her living room, she placed Frank's medals in a small display case on a shelf. Beside it, she placed the photo of Mai and Frank, along with a photograph of Linda and Frank on their wedding day. Two glimpses of the same man. She smiled, recalling how once that knowledge would have pained her. Now it felt like a tribute to the full measure of his life. She found that acknowledging every facet, his joys, regrets, secrets, had deepened her love for him, even in absence. At last, the heaviness in Linda's heart eased. She realized that while war had inflicted scars no one could fully erase, the human spirit could still find reconciliation and peace. She saw that closure didn't mean erasing the past, but rather facing it, speaking its truths, and honoring the individuals who carried those truths across time. Linda's journey had begun with confusion and heartbreak, but it ended with an open heart, linked to Mai's quiet perseverance. Both of them united in admiration for a man who had lived with sorrow, but also with profound love. Now, as she sat on her porch in the mild evening air, Linda felt a gentle stirring of gratitude. The last glow of sunset painted the sky in soft hues. She closed her eyes and imagined Frank's voice, not from the tapes of regret, but from a place of warmth, thanking her for letting his story be known, for returning his words to Mai, for ensuring that the vow he made, "I will come back for you," had, in a symbolic way, come true through Linda's own pilgrimage. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.